So, hi everyone. Thanks for joining online. We have a couple of people here in the room who are letting people in as they arrive. So today we're really happy to be joined by Dr. Parisa Rashidi, who's joining us today from the University of Florida, where she's founding co-director of the Intelligent Critical Care Center. And she's also an associate professor at the Crayton Pruitt Family Department of Biomedical Engineering. And she's here today to talk to us about AI and pervasive sensing, the new frontier in acute care. So if you're ready, please share your screen and get started.
All right, thank you. Let me share my screen. Okay, there we go. All right. Well, I was about to say good morning, everyone, but then I realized you guys are not in Florida. So good afternoon, everyone. Glad to be here to have a chance to talk about some of the concepts related to using AI in the medical setting, especially in the ICU. All right, let's get started. Let me see if we, oh, okay. I'm trying to see if, oh, okay, there we go. Yeah, now it's working. All right, so what I will be talking about today is I will talk about a couple of different projects that we have been working on in my lab and in collaboration with my clinical collaborators. Most of those are in the acute care settings, basically meaning that either in the ICU or in the perioperative setting, before surgery, after surgery. And we will talk about different aspects of how we can monitor patients in those settings in terms of their cognitive functions, in terms of some of the visual cues, such as their mobility, physical function, as well as their clinical trajectory, how they are improving. I'll also talk a little bit about some of the other projects that we have, just very briefly, and then we will end the talk with some conclusions. Now, this is one of the slides that I usually like to show in my talks. I update this every year, and I think this kind of provides a very good introduction to how far along we have come in terms of developing AI models. It's not a young field, as you can see here, but recently, especially in the past couple of years, we have seen an exponential growth in terms of AI models. So we have gone from small models that we have seen, if you go all the way back to, for example, 1943, where we had very, very simple, just conceptual models, all the way to now, where we have like 7 billion models that are considered as small. And we are talking about much larger models. And every day there is a new breakthrough. What is going to be there in 2024? We don't know. We have some guesses, but we just have to wait and see. And in the same sense, there has been a lot of also progress for AI in medicine. And if I want to tell you about the applications, as I'm sure many of you do these days, you can just ask ChatGPT, and that will give you a better response, better than possibly. So we can use AI in medicine for many different purposes. For example, we can use that for diagnosis, drug development, personalized medicine, medical imaging. It can help to analyze the medical images. For clinical decision support, it can assist the physicians, and then you can also have more efficient workflows using AI. So there are a lot of different applications for AI in medicine. And today I'm going to talk about some of those in the acute care setting. Now, in terms of the projects that we are working on in my lab, here you can see a big picture of what we are working on. Very broadly, we are working on intelligent health monitoring in the acute care setting, as I mentioned, and we look at different aspects of monitoring. It can be the physiology of patient. It can be some of their facial cues, for example. Are they in pain? Are they in distress? Their physical functions. Can they move around a little bit? That might be very important in the ICU setting. We look at also the environment. How is the ICU room? Is there a lot of noise? They cannot get enough sleep. We also look at cognitive function using some of our automated technology and computer vision models. And then also, once the patients go home, can we look at their patient-generated health data and monitor them? So there are different aspects that we can look into. Now, in terms of the research beyond my lab, as was mentioned. I also direct the Center for Intelligent Clinical Care. And this is something that we started in 2020, and we have had a number of different programs that goes beyond just my lab. It is a large center that it is located between College of Engineering and College of Medicine. And basically, we bring faculty together, students together from the two colleges so they can work on some of those exciting projects in AI and healthcare. And we have had a number of events throughout our center. In about a week, we will have our next hackathon, for example, the AI to Heal 2024, where we will provide some prizes to the teams, and they will be working on some of the frontier problems for AI in healthcare. So this is just something also beyond my individual research lab. Now, going back to what we are doing in my lab, the big question that I would say we are focusing on is, how's the patient doing? And can we quantify that? So that's what we will be looking at today. And one of the first aspects that we want to look at is patient physiology and being able to predict their trajectory from clinical data. Now, why that is important? It can be very important to be able to look at the trajectory of patient, especially in real time, because it can be very important for monitoring how they are doing and how to adjust the interventions, but also for the resource allocations. We saw that during COVID. And traditionally, there have been some tools that you can use like once a day. Most of those are like manual tools. You look at the patient's blood pressure and some of the other aspects, and then you compute a score, and then that tells you the patient doing better or they are getting worse. And this can be especially important in the ICU because it's not very easy to get one number that describes your patient. Patients usually have multiple organ dysfunctions, and it is a complex phenomena that is going on. So being able to summarize how's the patient doing in one number, that gives you a really powerful tool. One of the first works that we looked at this problem was a model that we called as Deep SOFA. It was published in 2019. And back then, if you remember, transformers were just beginning to become popular. So we used a transformer model and self-attention model. And basically, we used also some interpretability approaches to be able to look at some of the here you can see also how it is working in real time. We use also interpretability approach to see how the patient is evolving over time and what are some of the contributing factors. And here you can see how it was working well in practice. The blue line that you see here on the plot is our score, predicted mortality based on Deep SOFA, and the gray line that you see is based on the actual clinical score that is used routinely. And you can see that for a patient that passed away, unfortunately, our tool is able to predict that their accuracy from the beginning, but the clinical score, it does not do a very good job at predicting the risk of mortality. So this was one of the first works where we looked at predicting the trajectory. More recently, we have been looking at a broader problem that is acuity. We have been looking at acuity that is a broader definition beyond just mortality. And for defining acuity, we have worked with our clinical collaborators. They have defined a phenotyping method. So based on some of the clinical variables, they are able to identify what stage the patient is in. And basically, in this new work that we have recently published, we are looking into whether we can predict the stage of acuity for the patients and whether we can also predict their need for life-sustaining therapies, such as, for example, blood infusion, the need for vasopressors, CRRT, the continuous renal therapy, and some of these other therapies that might be needed for the patient. And this is what we have been doing in this work. For all of our work, we are trying to perform extensive validation as much as possible. In this work, we have been using 3 different data sets. We have been using Mimic. Of course, that's everyone's favorite. If you have heard of data sets in the healthcare domain, Mimic is one of the most popular one that is public. We also use EICU. That's a collection of data from many different hospitals. We also incorporated our own data set at University of Florida, about 52,000 ICU admission. That gives us a very large data set also. And we have been doing different types of validation, internally, externally, based on the public data sets, temporally, to look at how well the models are doing if you apply a model that was built based on data from 5 years ago, how well it's doing when you apply to data from today. And we also recently have started our prospective validation. We have been doing the validation right now for about 300 patients. So it's running in real time in our UF center. And that's the system, real-time system that you see here. Oh, actually, sorry, I did not move forward. So here we go. Now, what models we are using? In terms of the models that we are using, we have been using, again, some flavors of transformer models. In this case, we have been using a model that we extended called stress that is particularly well suited for irregular data. So instead of taking in the input tokens as you would see in a regular transformer, it takes time value variable tuples, and then based on that, it's able to deal with irregularly sample multivariate clinical time series. So that is particularly very well suited for our specific application. And here you can see how long does it take to train that, about 9 minutes per epoch on A100. And the inference time is also, it's reasonable. Now, if you have been following the AI news in recent month, in December, we saw a lot about state space models. They have been existing actually for quite some time, but one particular model that came out was Mamba. And state space models, if you don't know about them, those can provide some benefits that is a trade-off between transformers and the good old-fashioned RMNs. With transformers, we have the attention, so we can handle the sequence, pay attention to all of the sequence at once, but it comes at significant computational and memory costs. As we know, it's quadratic. With RNNs, the memory is better, and that is debatable because if you are using back propagation through time, then still it can impose its own memory. But nonetheless, it has problems with long-term dependencies. Now, the state space models, they provide a trade-off between the goods of both worlds, and that's what Mamba does. It is also providing some advantages in terms of providing selective state space, which basically allows you to pay attention to more relevant input information, and it has linear time complexity with respect to the input length. And that's the paper. If you have not seen that, I would suggest to take a look at that. So we decided to also use the Mamba model with the data that we have and look at, again, some of the problems that we have been looking at. And here you can see that it is the training and also inference time are kind of better. It is improved. The previous model, the transformer model, it was 0.23 millisecond, and here we have 0.18. So it is better, but it's not like half. And also the training time is better. How does it work in terms of the performance? Here you can see the performance. And based on our data so far, we have seen that the Mamba model might be a little bit slightly better in some cases, but most of the time they are kind of comparable with the transformer model that we have. So I know that many people are looking into this. The jury is still out. For long-term dependencies, it might be better. So we are looking into also extending beyond the 4-hour windows that we have been looking into because we wanted to do more real-time prediction and looking at the entire patient history. There is where, for example, Mamba might be more suitable. So more experiments to come. All right. That was a very brief overview of some of the works that we have been doing in terms of looking at the patient physiology and how we can use electronic health record data that we have in order to predict the trajectory of patients using some of the AI tools that we have these days. Now, let's switch gears a little bit here and look at a different, not exactly different, but it's complementary, I would say, direction. Well, as I mentioned, we have a lot of data. For example, at UF, we have 52,000 patient encounters that we have been collecting, and it's increasing that we can use to develop models that are based on electronic health record data. But there is a lot of data that is not actually captured in the but rather it is assessed by the ICU nurses, either they documented indirectly or some cases they might not even document that. And even if they document it, in many cases, it means that the nurses have to do the assessment repetitively manually. Examples, physical functions. How do you know if a patient has enough mobility? The nurse has to go into the room of the patient and check them to see they have their own score sheets that is based on certain criteria. They go through all of these criteria, check them, and then they get a score. So that's how they get the score for physical function. The same is true also for something like pain. Many of ICU patients, they might not be able to talk because they have the ventilation mask, they have the oxygen mask. So how do you know they are in pain? How do you adjust their opioid medication? They again have those score sheets. They go through that, they look at certain facial muscles and also activity of the patient. Based on that, they add them up and they say, for example, this patient has a pain score of 6. But as you can imagine, that is manual, that is subjective depending on who is observing, who is being observed. In many cases, it has been not very accurate. And also the nurses, they just have so much time. They can go into the room of patient 1, and then they have to move on to patient 2 and 3 and 4 and so on. So it's not possible to monitor the patients in real time. They can observe them just for a short period of time. And they might not also capture all of the other information. For example, we know that delirium in the ICU is a significant problem. And most of the time it happens because of the circadian rhythm disruption. Why? Because there is bright light in the room throughout the night. The nurses come in at the middle of the night. They take the patient for a procedure. There is this loud background noise of the devices, beep, 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 all the time. And there might be excessive visitation. But so far, we haven't had a very good way of characterizing those factors. So although they're important, we don't have a direct way of capturing this. And in this project, what we focused on was exactly this problem. So how can we use sensor data in order to capture those type of information that is not directly captured by EHR system? And so far, we have been collecting one of the largest, actually, I believe it might be the largest data sets of this kind. We have collected data from 300 patients on many different modalities. We use depth cameras and also RGB cameras in the ICU room and record data for up to 7 days, 24 hours. We have wearable sensors on the patients, including accelerometers, recording EMG. We also have IoT devices in the room that can capture light, sound pressure level, and many of the other different related metrics. And then we are also integrating the clinical data with that. As you can imagine, there are a lot of challenges associated with this. We have been spending so much time just on building the system, not on the machine learning side, although that is also important, but that comes first. That's the infrastructure. And that's what you see here. This is the system that we have been developing. It has a local pervasive sensing system that is in the ICU room. And then we also have our server where all of the data is being submitted to after, and then it is pre-processed, it is processed, it is provided to our AI models, and also it becomes integrated with the data from Epic which for those of you that don't know is the major electronic health record system vendor with a major market share in the US. So we also capture data from Epic and we integrate that with the data that we are capturing from those sensors. And then we provide that to the system engineers, the annotators. I will talk about that are annotating the data. There is an interface for the researchers, and also on the ICU side, we have an interface for the nurses, clinical coordinators. So if they need to, they can stop the system. If they need to, they can delete some of the information. And here you can see, for example, the output from our depth cameras and also RGB cameras. We have been going through, again, many different system designs as well as also model designs. Our most recent models are based on Yellow 8 for detecting how many people are in the room, because we realize that the number of visitation has an association with, for example, delirium incidents. And for the depth, we have been looking at segment anything model, SAM, for tracking the patient's in-depth images, which is not a trivial task, and it has its own complications and challenges. The data annotation is quite challenging because, first of all, it's very time consuming. In terms of the facial AUs, when you're looking at detection of pain and agitation in patients, it is not like there is any model out there that would work, because most of the facial expression models, they have been developed for cases where the person is facing the camera directly and they are right in front of the camera. That's not the case for patients. Their face might be tilted, they might be under the cover, and also the AUs are very different. The AUs, the action units, facial action units that we are looking at are very different than those that are associated with pain and agitation. Compare that to those that people usually study in other applications. They usually look at some of the other emotional AUs, action units. So it is very time consuming. We have a number of annotators in the house, usually between 4 to 7. It depends on the number of models that we are training, how many images do we need. We also have annotation managers to kind of make sure everything is annotated correctly. But still, it's impossible. When you have so much data, millions and millions of frames even per patient, you need to have a method that can detect which one of the frames actually should be selected for annotation. We have built our own in-house annotation tools. You can see the interfaces here, and also connect that to our active learning models that can detect which one of the frames actually should be selected for providing to the annotators. That's deployed in our system, and that works, and you're using that in production. So that provides us with a more effective way of using the annotators' time, as opposed to just giving them a sample of our data that might not be very informative. And in terms of the facial AU dataset, we so far we have been collecting data from more than 100 participants just on face that has been labeled. We have more participants, and the number of annotated participants is increasing, but that's the number that has been used for developing our latest model. And I believe that is the largest, again, data set of its kind in uncontrolled setting. Most of the other similar data sets that you might see out there, for example, BP4D, DISPA, UNBC, those are all controlled settings. This is the only uncontrolled setting. And we have been also developing some of the models for detecting those facial action units that are associated with pain, agitation. In those cases, we have been using vision transformers, such as the swim transformer. We found that it works particularly well in our case. And that's one of the models that we have been using. And here you can see, for example, what are some of the related AUs that we see that are associated with low pain and high pain. And we have similar results for other conditions in the ICU. And this is an example of how the real-time AU detection model works in real time. That's my student. So far, she was the one who was working on developing these AU detection model based on swing transformer. And again, those AUs, those are the clinical AUs, action units that most of the time are not seen in other tools out there because those are associated with pain and agitation, which might not have many applications in something like, for example, a web application or some of the other applications for these type of tools. Now, you might ask, well, how about the privacy of patients? Can you share the data? Unfortunately, no, because in many cases, if you're dealing with patient faces, that's considered as protected health information. And although we have the consent from patients, this is very difficult. So how do you even come up with a data set that can help other researchers actually develop similar models? This is another thing that we have been working on using latent diffusion models. I'm sure you all have heard about the generative AI and the diffusion models. And here we develop a diffusion model that can be conditioned on AUs. And in our case, it is a little bit different because we have multiple AUs. So it's multi-label because a person who is showing pain, they might be showing multiple different AUs. For example, they might be closing their eyes at the same time. They might be raising their eyebrows and also wrinkling the corner of their mouth. So the question was that, can we generate fake faces with those AUs? And this is exactly what we have been doing. And here you can see the results. We are still working on this. And this is an exciting line of work that we have been working on. It's computationally intensive. We use 4 NVIDIA A100s and it was running for 3 days. Well, compared to some of the LLMs, of course, it's kind of small, but still, I think it was one of the more intensive, time-intensive, computationally intensive models that we have trained. Looking at a different data modality, we also have been looking at environmental data because that's also important. What is the light intensity in the ICU room? What is the amount of noise that we are getting? And as I mentioned before, we have IoT devices in the room that can capture the level of noise. We can capture the light intensity. We can even capture some of the air quality measures in the room. And we have been looking into some of those metrics and how those can be also associated with something like delirium, for example, that usually is associated with circadian rhythm disruption. And we have found quite some association with the amount of noise as well as also the some of the other environmental factors. And that kind of shows us how we need to maybe change some of the clinical practice, how that needs to be changed in order to make sure that the patients are getting enough sleep, their circadian rhythm is not disrupted. And actually, we have a project that is working on that so we can prompt the clinicians, the care providers about the lack of sleep, the environment, and how that needs some change. Okay. So that was mostly related to some of the ICU metrics and how we can monitor the ICU patients and what can be done in terms of monitoring them. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. And now I want to talk a little bit also about another interesting project that we have been working on with one of my colleagues, Dr. Catherine Price. She's a neuropsychologist, and we have been looking at perioperative setting, especially for older adults, and how we can measure their cognitive function. Why? It has been shown that the older adults who undergo surgery, some of them actually, they have a rapid cognitive function decline right after the surgery. Mechanistics of that is not quite well known yet. Many think it might be because of the analgesic. It might be because of the already kicking in dementia that is accelerated by the impact of the surgery trauma. But what is important is that the American College of Surgeons actually is recommending that cognitive screening should be done for older adults who are undergoing surgery. Problem is that it requires a lot of time. Each one of those assessments takes about 15 minutes. You need a nurse that is trained, and then you also need someone who actually can assess the results. And sometimes it's not very trivial. One of the tests that has been done and has been used in these kind of settings is a simple test. It's called the clock test. How it works is that you give the participant a piece of paper and you ask them, can you draw a clock and set the hands to something like 10 after 2? You ask them to do that from memory, and you also ask them to copy a clock. So 2 different versions. You will be surprised. That simple test, how much it can tell you. It can tell you a lot about verbal understanding, memory, spatial knowledge, fine motor skills. Even, for example, if they are missing a hook in one of the digits, that can tell you a lot. If it is asymmetric, it can tell you a lot about some of their spatial knowledge and also their verbal understanding. There is a lot that it can tell. So we decided to use this in the perioperative setting and use computer vision models in order to make this more automated. And this is what we have been doing with my colleague, Dr. Catherine Price. So far, we have been collecting about 25,000 digitally acquired clocks from older adults. And here you can see some of our published work in this area. And it has been based on, initially it was based on digital pens that we were using. More recently, we have transitioned into using tablets because that's just more pervasive. And here you can see example of some of those clocks that using our tool, our machine learning models were assigned increasing probability of the patient having dementia. As you can see, for example, this one, it's missing a lot of elements, and also pay attention that it's asymmetric. That's actually a telltale sign of having dementia. Again, there are a number of works that we have published. This is one of the more recent works that was published in 2023. And we used a model, a semi-supervised model, because we have a lot of unlabeled data, but relatively speaking, small amount of labeled data. And it was able to leverage the unlabeled data very well. And interestingly, we also found out that there are a number of clock features that are associated with conditions such as dementia that have been already indicated by the literature, but there were also some of the novel features that we found. For example, in case of dementia, we found out that one of the signs is drawing avocado-shaped clocks. Something similar to what we have here. Yeah, here you can see that in those pictures. And it's not a new discovery. There also have been a lot of other visual features that have been associated with different conditions. For example, in patients who have micrographia or the peripheral motor disease, it has been shown that they tend to draw smaller clocks, or there is an association between the large clocks and those who have memory problems. So each condition actually shows different visual signature patterns, which is quite interesting. We also have been looking at speech analysis and how that can tell us about the cognitive functions of older adults. And again, we are relying on one of the established cognitive function assessment tools that is out there is the story recall assessment that traditionally has been used. And basically you tell a story and then you ask the participant to recall the story. And in terms of the number of pauses that they have, in terms of how much they remember, that can tell you, again, a lot about some of the underlying cognitive function issues. But as you can imagine, that requires time, that requires someone to record that and also go over that and also pay attention to all of those subtle changes and parameters if they can detect all of them. Well, again, we automated this method and we have been using different types of models. We are looking, for example, at the pause parameters, how long they were pausing, what is the number, how many pauses they had, what is the length of their longest pause. And also we looked at some of the acoustic features, and using that, we said, can we also look at cognitive impairment? Can we actually predict cognitive impairment simply based on this test? What if we incorporate demographics and plus some of those features? And as you can see here, for example, AUC 0.79, that's not bad. This has been actually one of the lines of work that I think there is a lot of potential for more work in this area. Now, you might be saying, all right, well, that's great. All of that is happening in acute care setting when the patients are in the hospital or staying in the hospital. So you can have all of these tools in order to monitor them in terms of their cognitive functions, in terms of mobility, physical function, in terms of their physiological changes and trajectory. But many patients who undergo, for example, surgery, they go home and they are not monitored. What about them? Especially in older adults who undergo surgery, we need better way of monitoring them once they go home, once they are discharged. In this project with my colleague, Dr. Todd Manini, we have been exactly looking at this problem, and we are using smartwatches in order to get data from the older adults who undergo surgery, cardiothoracic surgery in our patient population, and then they go home. And we have been looking into what type of data we can collect. And we did not start with our assumptions because we could have collected many different metrics, but we wanted those metrics to be incorporated back into EPIC, which is the electronic health record system that we are using here at University of Florida. Because in many cases, you might have a smart watch, I might have a smartwatch, but the data that I'm collecting stays on my watch. It doesn't go to my provider. So what if we incorporate that into the EHR system that those doctors are using? And we decided to do that, but our question was, what informations are actually helpful to those providers? Because they are already overloaded with information. They already are overburdened with a lot of work that they are doing. So what is important to them? How can we help them as opposed to making assumption about what would be helpful? And we, in those papers that you see here, we have been looking at that. We have had a number of unstructured interviews, study groups, and we have been looking into which one of those metrics actually would be helpful. And this is the list that you see here, like mobility was very important, pain, mood, fatigue, sleep quality, wound healing after surgery. So those are the ones that are important to the physician. And all of this information, along with the information that is collected from the sensors, is collected and sent in real time to the electronic health record system. So the providers, they can pull up the patient information, and at the same time that they are looking at the clinical data, they can also see some of the data that is coming through the smart watches that those patients have been provided. Okay, so that was mostly about some of the work that we have been doing in the clinical setting and some of the models that we have been developing. We also have done some work in the educational setting that you see here. This is a work by one of my PhD students, Scott Siegel, and he has been working on developing open source web applications that can provide an interactive experience so that the students can learn and explore some of the concepts related to reinforcement learning and neural network in a 3D environment that they can interact with that and can manipulate that. And it's compatible with almost all of the modern browsers. And the cool thing about this is that you don't need to install any deep learning libraries. You just need to go to the website and then use that. So we are at the stage of testing this out at University of Florida in 2 of the CS classrooms, and we will see how it is going to impact the student learning and how they can learn the concepts better. On another side, we also have been working a lot on developing medical AI curriculum for interdisciplinary teams. A lot of us who are working in AI, we have the technical background, but we don't have the domain knowledge. And then you have the medical residents, the clinicians, nurses, who have the domain knowledge, but they don't have the AI expertise. And that usually becomes a problem, especially when you're working on large interdisciplinary projects, or even for students who want to delve deeper into some of those aspects of clinical AI, medical AI. And in collaboration with a number of other institutes, 20 institutes across the US as a consortium, we have been funded by the National Institute of Health to develop one of the largest data sets in the critical care, but also to develop the educational modules for medical AI based on the data set. And I'm leading that module. We have been developing a number of Python notebooks based on the data that we are generating. And hopefully within a year or so, you will see the first samples. It is exciting because this data set, unlike Mimic, which is from a single institute, it will be based on multimodal data, even waveforms, medical images from diverse institutes across US, which is something that so far we have been missing. So we're quite excited about that. And hopefully that will be also a great resource to anyone who is working on medical aid. All right. That was a brief overview of what we have been doing in my lab in collaboration with colleagues. And again, this is interdisciplinary work. This is teamwork at the end of the day. But what is our long-term vision is here that we want to have patient monitoring approaches, especially in the acute care settings that are more objective, that are more precise, that are more granular. So you're not just taking a measurement once a day or monitoring the patient every 2 hours when the nurse is in the room, but make it more granular, collect the data that we can at different granularity, and also is encompassing. And that's why we are trying to use multimodal data in monitoring patients. Still, we are at the beginning stages. I think medical AI has a long way to go, but hopefully there will be a lot of progress that we will see in the coming years. And of course, there are a lot of challenges that still we see in the field that I think we need to address as a community. One of the things is that mostly as a community, and my team is also guilty of doing that, is we have been focused on prediction for good reasons. If you want to do intervention, I think that in terms of liability, in terms of the ethical AI issues, and also in terms of where we are nowadays in terms of the AI models, it has been a little bit more difficult. But I think the next step would be developing more of reinforcement learning, developing more of the intervention tools in the clinical setting, not just predicting how the patient is doing, but what can be done. And that would be very difficult, and that would require a lot of validation, especially prospective validation. And with my team, we have been trying to have very extensive validations, and sometimes that is at the cost of delaying the study by even 1 year, because you have not only to test your model on internally, but you have to test it externally on data from other institutes. How well does it generalize in other institutes? You have to test it temporally. If I have data from 5 years ago, does it work right now? The model, does it work? The clinical practices, the guidelines change all the time, so there's a good chance it might not. And whether it also works in a truly prospective manner. If you deploy it, and if you use it right now, does it work in clinical practice? Usually we also do that at stages. We do silent, validation, and then you can do the actual in-clinic validation. But those are a lot of different stages, and that's what makes medical AI a little bit more challenging compared to some of the other fields. For example, if you're developing a model based on some of the data sets that are available on the web, it's all you need is text associated with images, and then you can use that in order to develop a model like CLIP or any of the other models. But in medical AI, it's a lot more difficult. Getting the data, making sure that the data is secure, validating those models is very important. Data sharing, that's where it comes into play. And that's why the consortium that I was talking about is an important step. And I think that also in Europe, there has been a lot of work done in that area. And in fact, you might be ahead of us in the sense of data sharing because of some of the issues that we have in the US in terms of some of the HIPAA rules. But that becomes more and more important because those models need to be working in a way that is generalizable. If you take it from one institution to the next, it should still work. Federated learning, I think that will become more and more an accepted approach in the coming years. And along with all of those, again, we need to also work on explainability, interpretability. As the models are becoming more and more complex, can we provide good interpretation? And also, can we prevent what we call as fair washing, that sometimes you can develop explainability approaches, but at the end of the day, you look at the explainability approaches and it might result in unfounded conclusions. So you have to be also careful about all of those ethical implications. But I think there are a lot of, in summary, there are a lot of exciting opportunities out there. There might be some challenges, but as long as there are challenges, it means that we also have some opportunity to work on some of the exciting solutions. So that's all that I have for my talk today. Thanks again for listening. And if you have any questions, I would be more than happy to take them.
Okay, thanks very much. So what we'll do is we'll take questions from people in the room first. Anyone online who would like to ask a question, please either drop it in the chat or raise your hand and then I'll unmute you. So I'll start with a very quick question. What data would you like to have access to you don't currently have access to? Is there any sort of like really kind of obvious thing that if you did have access to this information, it would help quite a lot in some of your applications?
Yeah, I think that if you had access to data from other institutions, that would be very helpful. I know that in the UK, because of the way that your national health system is set up, you have access to data from the other institution. But here in the US, we don't have a similar system. We have set up a system to have access to data across Florida, not all of that. But for example, we don't have access to a rural area in Kentucky, or we don't have access to data from another place, say in Montana. So that causes an issue and a problem in terms of generalizability of those models. If there was one thing that I could ask for, it would have been the data from other institutions. Another thing is data from other modalities. Right now, we don't have all the modalities that we as humans, when we go into the ICU, we have a lot more data that we can interact with. All the conversations that are happening, all the information that we see in terms of the visual cues, and we have done some work in terms of that, but I think there could be a lot more that can be done in that area. So we still don't have the complete picture, complete clinical picture in terms of the same developed data that the humans have access to versus the computer.
Okay, thank you. Any questions, Laura?
I've got one. What's the microphone?
It's there. If you speak louder.
Okay. You've got some very, very large data sets. How do you deal with the fact that there's a lot of missing values in those? So if you put in sort of placeholder values or sort of an average value, how do you know that that isn't heavily biasing the model?
That's a very good question. And I think that's a question that comes up in almost all of the machine learning models, regardless of the data. We have been working on different imputation methods. In the past, we have been working, for example, on some of the deep learning based approaches based on the Gaussian models. And one thing that we have been doing is we try to also validate the imputation. Because that's also important. If you are imputing, for example, a physiological sign, then you have to make sure that makes sense. In some cases, we do that computationally using an approach that has been validated, or we do that using expert domain knowledge. And that can be in sometimes quite complex, like in case of the O2, the oxygen that the patient is on. For one of our papers, actually, we had quite a workflow that we were going through if the patient is on oxygen mask versus oxygen tank versus this device, then we need to use this formula. So it's not like just replacing that. And that is one thing that I always tell the trainees that are doing. It's not just one value, average value, or even a more sophisticated approach. So you have to work very closely with the clinicians to make sure that it makes sense. Some of the other approaches that we have also used, they completely go around the imputation question. For example, the transformer model that I was showing, because of the way that it is handling the data, it is able to handle irregularly sampled data. So there is no need for imputation. So you don't provide any potentially false information to the model. And that can be, again, helpful. But this is an evolving field. I agree with you. There are times that you really need to be careful in terms of if you're doing imputation, what does it mean?
Okay, thank you.
I think I have a question, but I'm not sure if I.
Yeah, just make sure the microphone can pick you up.
Okay. Hi. So when you were saying, you get all this data and then you create basically an average value at the end. So that should basically, that one value should tell you how well the patient's doing, slash predicting if they're getting worse. If, say you're getting all this data from, every single patient, and so many different types of data. Is this, once you've got the model, are you going to apply it to like every hospital in the US or every patient that comes into a hospital? So that's what I mean. I'm not sure if I'm getting it correct, but it seems like a lot of data and a lot of data per hospital and per person. Is it not massively expensive, or it takes a lot of memory? Basically, how would it work on a grand scale, if I've got it correct?
Yeah, great question. And I wouldn't say it is mostly a technical problem. It's not even in terms of the cost, although the way that the cost would work, it's not also clear. I think it is mostly because of the way that the US healthcare system is being set up. We don't have a national healthcare system. So you have those different healthcare systems, each one of those specific to a region or specific to a city, or maybe in some rare cases for a state. But those are isolated from each other. Those are siloed. They don't talk to each other. Why they would need to also share data with each other? Because there is no business incentive for that. The data that they are holding actually keeps their customers with them. If I could take my data from here in Florida very easily to another healthcare system, say in California, then, or even in my own city, if I could switch those very easily, then it would mean that the switching cost is low. So they cannot lock in the customers. So that is one of the business related problems that we have here in the US that you might not face the same thing in the UK. And that has made it also very difficult for sharing data because those institutions, they do not have the same incentive for sharing data. Now, in terms of the academic institutions like us, we are trying to form those coalitions and we are trying to form those consortium. For example, the chorus one that I was mentioning, National Institute of Health is trying to break down those barriers. So we will have access to data for building those models. Ultimately, when you want to deploy those models, I think that as long as you're talking about some of those academic institutions, the cost of deploying would be in terms of the infrastructure that you need to have in place if you want to do that in real time. One of the problem, for example, if you want to get the waveform data, the true waveform data here in the US, it's difficult because the way it is stored. The waveform, it is very high resolution. Sometimes it's 60 hertz. And it doesn't get all stored in the EHR system because it would be a waste of storage, right? And it would be impossible to store that for all of the patients. So the way that they do it is they keep it for 24 hours and then they drop it. So now you're trying to kind of build the infrastructure in order to get the waveforms and not just the minute by minute summary of the vital forms. So part of that is the infrastructure. Once that infrastructure is in place for real-time also predictions, it would be great. But beyond that is also the data sharing model that is different from yours.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if I answered the question.
No, you definitely did. No, thank you.
Sure.
I had a question, trying to sort of formulate it. So see, you started talking about these two different kind of projects. You have the first one where you're taking patient information, as I understand it, to determine their outcomes when they're in the ICU. So I guess my question for that first would be, is that what's the application, or is there application on a patient by patient basis? So if you have somebody that came in, flagged this person's got a very high chance of dying, is that more informative to the healthcare providers in that moment than the intangible information they may already have access to? So say somebody kind of comes in and they have like all these comorbidities, which are obvious to the healthcare provider, but may not be attached to their data. Does your model saying, yeah, this patient is above average likely to pass away, is that useful, or is it more of a, the ICU can say, oh, for the 20 patients we have at the moment, there is a higher than average mortality likelihood, therefore we should do some resource allocation more effectively?
Yeah, great question. I think it comes into play in terms of the potential interventions that you can provide. For example, in most of those cases, as I showed here, those scores, the purpose of those scores is to tell the provider who is at risk and what type of interventions do I need to provide. And how do you make those decisions for providing intervention? Is that you need some sort of metric that tells you this is the level of risk for this patient. And in fact, here you can see that the patient starts from green initially, and then they go into the yellow zone, and then they go into the red zone. The data that you get as a physician in the ICU, it's very complex. And also the traditional tools, as you can see here, for example, this one does not predict the risk of mortality for the patient. So the clinicians might miss those intervention opportunities simply because they cannot estimate the risk of mortality, the risk of a complication, the risk of acuity stage being changed from stable to unstable. If you can predict those in advance, then you have an opportunity for intervention. But when you have a clinical score like this gray line that you see here in this plot, that basically tells you it's less than 20% chance that this patient would die. But this patient was a 25-year-old female patient that unfortunately passed away right here. And the model, the clinical score that is routinely being used in the US, it tells you otherwise. So as a busy clinician, you might be looking at the routine clinical score. And although based on your expertise, you might adjust that, in some cases, you might be missing those opportunities for intervention. And I think that if those AI models can help prevent even a small fraction of those incidents and provide opportunities for intervention, that still would be a huge win for those AI models.
Okay. And so do you imagine sort of seeing this in real time on something like a heart rate monitor, which the patient may or may not be able to see? Or would this be something that the the hospital staff would have access to like on their computing system. Maybe that's not the question that you're interested in, like the actual execution.
No, yeah, absolutely. And that's, I did not show that. I did not want to go into details of all of this. But this is actually a system that we have deployed. And we have also implemented the interface for this. So the clinicians can see the output. We have done that for post-operative complications, where the physicians can actually see the risk of post-operative complications before the patient goes into surgery. Once they are in the operating room for different complications like sepsis, many of the other complications, and then once they are out. And we have tested that with the physicians, and we have looked at many different aspects, not just in terms of the AI performance, but also in terms of usability and usefulness. The same thing right now, we have deployed this model into our real-time clinical system. And right now we are working on developing the real-time interface. We already have the interface that you see here that kind of shows the score in real time, but making that such that we are making sure that it is compliant with all of the usability criteria that we have in mind. We hope that will be completely deployed within the next 6 months or so.
And do you imagine suggesting interventions, or is that left to the healthcare provider?
No, not at this point. At this point, so we are staging this. Again, as I mentioned, internal validation, external prospective validation. Right now, we are at the silent prospective validation stage. So right now, we have been running the model actually on prospective data for about 8 months, and the performance is good. After that, we will do it in a next day stage. So we will not show the information for the same day because we don't want to prime the clinicians. If in any way the model, because it has not been fully validated in the truly clinical setting, we want to look at the next day outcome. So we will show the results to them for the next day, and then we will ask them, hey, this is what our model was predicting. This is what you had the data. What are your thoughts? And we kind of do that in different ways. Once we are past that stage, I think we will deploy it such that the interventions might be also proposed to those clinicians. But as somebody who is working this field, I don't want to move too fast because a lot can be at risk. So we definitely want to stage it as much as possible.
That makes sense. Okay, thank you. I personally got loads more questions, but I suppose just out of respect for your time, we'll probably call it a day there. So thanks very much for joining us today. We'll give the speaker one last round of applause.
Thanks everyone for coming and listening. Thank you.